for this. Okay, so for much of the past year, immigration arrests and enforcement have dominated both local and national news. Here in the Northwest, the University of Washington Center for Human Rights has collected data on thousands of people who have been detained and moved around the country before deportation. In many cases, residents of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington have debated what role local police should be playing in either helping or hindering these federal immigration officers. And this past month, there was a fascinating debate in Idaho's deep red legislature that saw local law enforcement pushing back against the White House's grandest deportation dreams. I'm Ryan Hass, and I'm joined today by reporter Alex Duggan, who covers crime and courts for Spokane's excellent newspaper, The Spokesman Review. Alex also covered Idaho before that, so she's well versed. She's a very fun writer and a scoop machine, so I think she's kind of the perfect guest to have here on this episode of Notes from the Edge. Hey, Alex.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. So maybe just to set the table here, can you describe these bills that were in the legislature this year? Like what were they proposing to do?
A lot of them were, I mean, there was many immigration bills that came up this year, but most of them centered around more restrictive policies. And again, the state legislature can't regulate federal law or federal policies, but they can try and intervene as much as they want. And a lot of those bills centered around kind of Idaho being the middleman between certain types of immigration enforcement.
Mhm.
And that was kind of a point of contention with the local police because, again, Idaho can't do much with federal authorities, but they can try and impose, more laws and restrictions with the local police. And so they
Mhm.
were trying to get local law enforcement involved in federal immigration actions. And that was a huge, again, point of contention with the local law enforcement,
What
especially
so
in
what
North Idaho, too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what were they asking? I mean, my understanding was like they were like, "Hey, when you stop somebody, you need to ask them like you could stop them for a traffic ticket and you need to ask them what their immigration status is." Is that right?
Yeah, so they were trying, I mean, this is one bill. I mean, all of them I think for the most part died. But the one bill in particular was asking police to verify someone's nationality, or
Mhm.
immigration status. And uh, the police were like, that's, first of all, that's not our job because we, when we arrest someone, their status is verified by immigration enforcement or the feds when they're in jail. Like, this is not something that we take part in. And again, they
Mhm.
also don't have resources to those databases. They don't, they're not civil enforcement officers. And I think for people forget that immigration is a civil issue. And you're going to teach your officers who focus on crime to deal with civil, issues, which that's a whole other ball game
Right.
that they have
It's a
to
whole
take
other
part in.
aspect of
Yeah.
law.
So, right. And that again, and so I think one officer, the Rathdrum police chief, was talking to me about it, and he was just like, I don't even know where we would start and how to do that. And, that's a lot of them were just like, that's just not our job. That's just not our job.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
police already overworked as it is. You know, that's just not something that I think feel comfortable doing.
Yeah,
So
and you know, I want to come back to that point in a second, but one thing I also thought was interesting that you reported on was like the White House is like actively reaching out during this legislative session and saying like, "Come on guys, we got to do this. You have to do this." I mean, what was the gist of that letter and, how did lawmakers receive it and how did, people who would be affected by this legislation like the police sort of receive that outreach?
yeah, so that letter from the White House was actually trying to push another immigration bill. And that immigration bill is a 287G agreement, which is code for federalizing local officers or giving them federal duties so they can carry out the duties of ICE. So,
Mhm.
it's a three-prong model. You have like the task force model, the warrant model, the jail enforcement model. There's a lot of things that go into this model that basically allow local police to do ICE, to carry out ICE's duties. And this bill that they were trying to push was requiring police to apply for these programs and take part in them. Um, and police didn't want to do that because in Idaho they already work with ICE. It's not like Washington. Idaho doesn't have a law that
Yeah.
prohibits local police from working with ICE like Washington does. Um, but you know, it to them it was just like this is just adding more strain on our already strained resources, especially in small departments that can't apply for these types of programs or have an officer go off to do federal stuff when they need them in the community to
Yeah.
do community centric things. So they kind of reworked the bill a little bit, but at the end of the day, the White House sent this letter on the 26th of March that said, we encourage swift passage of this legislation. We commend Idaho for trying to pass immigration legislation. And that is by far, I think, the most federal involvement I have seen. And again, this is taking my experience. I've been out of Idaho for a while, but
Hmm.
personally, having the White House having a hand inside local government is a lot of the time what local government would try and avoid, especially Idaho, which is historically anti, a lot of federal oversight. And yeah, I mean, the letter came up in a Senate committee. So it wasn't just handed out to every lawmaker. It
Hmm.
was specifically given to this committee who has, I think like 6 or 7 members on it. And those are the only legislators that saw this letter. And one Democratic lawmaker in that committee was like, this is something I was shocked to see. I thought it was weird. I was taken aback by it. And it, for the most part, didn't get passed around. It didn't get shown to me. I mean, I was going around with this letter to other
Hmm.
lawmakers in Idaho and being like, have you seen this? Do you know what this is?
Hmm.
Even Republican lawmakers were like, I've never seen this. I don't know. Um, and then it just never took off, I guess. So
How did the like Republicans on that committee receive this letter, though?
that's a good question. I don't know. The letter I think was addressed to um the letter was just addressed to the lawmakers, but
Hmm.
the senator that sponsored the bill, he I think had it in his like had it with him. So I'm not sure
Hmm.
exactly who it was addressed to, but the lawmaker that sponsored the bill had it, and they get like these little packets that they pass around when they want to go through legislation, and it was like in the packet. Um, and yeah, it's just very interesting. At, another part is like, I was going through email records earlier last year about ICE in general in Kootenai County, and I had requested a bunch of email
Hmm.
records relating to ICE, and um, I noticed that DHS back in February was encouraging um, Idaho sheriff agencies to apply already. So this was already going on
I
well
see.
before this letter was sent. They were telling the sheriffs in the Idaho Sheriff's Association in the emails, DHS was saying, you should apply, you should apply.
Hmm.
And ultimately, 9 agencies take part in these 27 or 28.7G agreements.
Hmm.
Um, but
And so, like, what these programs are is you mentioned there's like three different models, basically, which is like the low, if I'm understanding right, the lowest is like a jail model where it's like, hey, we've arrested somebody for a crime. ICE or whoever from immigration enforcement comes in, they can like interview this person or take them into custody. Is that like that jail model? Is that what that is?
yeah, it's
Mhm.
basically just allowing uh the local sheriff's office or police to kind of assist ICE
Mhm.
doing other things in the jail, or ICE using the jail, or ICE participating. Yeah, so it kind of
Mhm.
gives these models require an MOU, which is a memorandum of understanding that it's just an agreement, like a contract
Hmm.
between like
Hmm.
an agency and ICE that says like we're going to do this. This is what we plan on doing. This is why. This is the um, the barriers and
And
yeah,
then,
jail, and
so
then the
then the
warrant
next
enforcement model.
model, yeah, the next model from the jail is what then? That how is that different?
Well, the warrant and the warrant model like allows local police to carry out ICE warrants, and then the task force model would actually like kind of, I think, is the most controversial. It would delegate a local officer as a federal officer
Hmm.
that can actually carry out more ICE duties than just being a part of the jail and doing a warrant or serving a warrant. It would be more, essentially it would actually take a police officer from a department and kind of take them away from the
Right.
department
Right.
and designate them as a federal officer. So you wouldn't be doing much local policing. You would be doing federal policing as a local officer.
I mean, one thing that I thought was interesting reading your stories is, hearing some of the officers talk. Like, there's this really great quote, which I pulled out here. This is from Ada County Sheriff Matt Clifford, and he says, they are tying our hands and making us work for the federal government, but only with this administration's goals in mind. I'm flabbergasted this is even an idea in conservative Idaho, and I think people forget that immigration law is federal law. I think what I found interesting about that is, like, when you listen to like blue states talk about sanctuary policies, they're like, the federal government's job is to enforce immigration. That is not our job. Like, you'll hear that line all the time with like sanctuary states. And, everybody knows like sanctuary status is like such a controversial, like, political football.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
really, like, at the core, what what this sheriff in Ada County and like sanctuary states are saying is the same thing, which is like, that's not my job. Like, you guys do your job, we'll do
Yeah.
our job, right?
Right, yeah, and also, I mean, again, like this is coming from another thing Sheriff Clifford talked about is like this is coming from a state that doesn't want a lot of federal involvement. It's very
Mhm.
states' rights centered. So to have the government have a hand in what we're doing and how we're policing, that's a problem for a lot of people. And it's also adds more training, adds more we need a system for local police to use because they don't have access to federal systems unless there's another MOU with the US Marshals or something. Like they don't have the resources they need to actually take part and do all of this. And I think that's, again, like the other bill that requires verification of someone's nationality. Another part of that bill was the police chief has to go in front of city council, or I guess not the police chief, whoever supplies
Mhm.
city council with these stats, or the commissioners with policing stats every month, has to collect immigration data. And the the police chiefs are like, we collect local data. How are we going to collect immigration data? How are we going, like, what, like, we already have an agency that does this. So,
Mhm.
very, um, I was really surprised to see local police stand up about this. And again,
Mhm.
like, not because not because I don't think highly of them or anything, but just because um it seems like an unusual clash, honestly. It
Right,
seems like a
right.
very unusual clash.
You have lawmakers who, conservative lawmakers are often saying, like, we need to support the police, we need to do everything we can to, quote unquote, back the blue or whatever. And, I saw some of the law enforcement officers you're speaking to are like, well, you're not backing the blue by giving us this like unfunded mandate to do all this
Yes.
extra work, right? Like, so there is like this cultural clash, which I thought was really interesting and unexpected.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, again, I kept asking them, like, a lot of conservatives are very much pro police. And when
Mhm.
the police came out and said, please listen to us, this is a bad idea, and, the legislation was pushed forward anyway, the police were upset. They're like,
Mm.
you are supposed to, you back us. You constantly say that you back the blue, and here you are.
Mhm.
We're, and legislation that we don't like is being pushed and you're not listening to us. You know, it's definitely an interest. It was very unusual to me. I was like, this is the most I've really seen. We see sheriffs testify frequently
Sure.
for things, but I just really felt like this is the most vocal I've seen the agencies, all agencies, the FOP, the Idaho Sheriff Association, the Chief of Police Association. I mean, they all were there. So again, it was very
When you
unusual.
were
And
when you were talking to, like, the law enforcement officers, I mean, what was their, like, feeling about this? Were they sort of like, "This is unexpected," or, "I can't believe that, X lawmaker is, like, just not caring about what I say about this?" Or, I mean, how were they interpreting what the lawmakers were doing?
I mean, a lot of them were just like, we don't want to get involved in politics.
Mhm.
That was
Mm.
they're like, we just want to do our job. We don't want to get involved in politics. Like we're like this is what we have to come out here and kind of like the Rostrum police chief said to me, like, we can't bury our head in the sand when when something happens. Like we have to
Mhm.
say something. But they don't it's not like that's what they want to do. They don't want to
Mhm.
have to come out and so I think that, you know, they tend to want to be hands off and you know support when they can and be a voice of you know knowledge and information when they can when lawmakers need them but again I think not being consulted um for some of these things or I guess them feeling like they weren't being heard was
Mhm.
kind of the biggest issue. I mean besides all the other things with the bill but they yeah.
Yeah. I also you did some reporting, I think it was this month even, about how the Idaho State Patrol is like losing a bunch of officers to Washington State because of pay. I mean, is that a factor here where I imagine if Idaho State Patrol can't keep people, then local departments are probably paying less and things like that. Is that an issue where like these departments are getting really strapped for staffing over whatever other issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always going to be an issue. I mean, I think nationwide police are seeing um, you know, staffing changes. Um, and I remember specifically when I was working in Boise, Boise PD had this huge retirement boom where a lot
Mm,
of the officers that had gotten there were retiring at the same time. And so um yeah, there's a lot of changes always, but it is interesting like the areas that are able to pay their officers more. I mean, I think I obviously ISP falls to the bottom of that list because they are um funded by the legislature and
mhm,
you know historically again like I said it's really really hard for conservative lawmakers to ask people to raise taxes or to raise taxes or ask for more money like that's you know Idaho prides itself on low taxes or
mhm.
these types of things. I mean we just saw the governor say we're gonna you know try and pass this huge tax cut um you know package and that ultimately is kind of now leading to budget issues and so you kind of have to I guess it's just like a there's a lot going on. Um, you know, you have to kind of give some and take some, and it's really hard
Uh-huh.
for again, it's really hard for people to want to pay more in taxes, especially in a conservative state where
Mm.
that's just not something that is typically aligned with conservative values.
Right, and I think you see that even more now, right? Like, I think there's a lot of debate that is happening nationally of, blue states, like Oregon or Washington or California, where people are like, well, look, they have such high taxes. People are fleeing these states. And I can totally see a state like Idaho who's like, yeah, we want to get some of those people. We want to bring them here. Um, and the selling point is like really low taxes, but at the same time when you have really low taxes it's like, yeah, you can't pay your police officers as much, you can't fund roads or healthcare or all these things. And so yeah, how do you maintain quality of living while still having such a low tax burden on your residents?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You know, I think one interesting thing about your reporting too is I think Idaho is often portrayed, particularly in national media, as like, the farthest right state. It's like, Handmaid's Tale or whatever. People have all these like preconceived notions about Idaho. I mean, how do you reconcile the actual place with like how the media portrays it? Because I think this issue really highlights that. You have police who are like presumably conservative to some degree saying like, no, what the White House is doing is crazy. We should not be doing this.
Yeah, I think again, like I think there's a balance, a good balance. I think the an issue, gosh, I could talk about this all day, but just to start at the beginning of the issue is again, local media is the most important source of information when it comes to local issues because
Mhm,
we have that perspective that maybe journalists parachuting in from national media don't. And not to shade national media or anything like that, but um, you know, the perception like Idaho is this huge right wing fascist
mhm.
um, of state. That's an opinion, and that's fine. But we have to also kind of look at um, I guess the pockets. How do I rephrase this
Well, is
without
it
offending
pockets
people?
or I mean, I think any person like can have a variety of views and they may be different. I think what this whole episode highlights is like the people who are necessarily who may be in the capital are not always representative of the viewpoints of everybody in the state, right? Or everybody who's a constituent. And so I think that's where perhaps some of that disconnect comes from because you can often have like lawmakers pushing very radical things and the populace is like, "Hey, whoa, wait wait a minute. That's not who we are. That's not who we want to be,"
Right.
right?
Right. So again, sorry about that. See, I again to your point, like I when I was a politics reporter in Idaho, I would constantly see um people come out in droves to testify against a certain bill. Um
Mhm.
and you would be like, okay, the constituents have spoken, the citizens have spoken, they've signed this petition, they've been at this protest. It's kind of clear maybe where we're leaning towards on this,
Mhm.
and then the bill would go through anyway, or it would be pushed anyway, or there would be no discussion on it. And I would see that more frequently, where I'd be like, the committee is full of you would have 30 people testify against it and one person testify for it, and the bill would still move through anyway.
Mm.
Um, and so I think that that probably does play a part in people's perception of Idaho, but there are like a lot of especially electeds in Idaho that maybe uh don't have those viewpoints that are kind of lost in translation. I think of the Coeur d'Alene mayor actually, who many far right people have disliked and
Hmm.
do dislike. And people think of Coeur d'Alene as like this far right
Right.
neo-Nazi hub, right? And, in reality, their mayor is very, very, very anti those things. And when he got elected, there was a lot of, I guess, pushback from the further right people, but it kind of shows you what the people want. The people elected this
Mhm.
guy, and he's come out multiple times against, just white supremacy, Christian nationalism. He's spoken, very, very often about these issues and very publicly. So, there are pockets of people that maybe get lost in translation in the national media, and that's kind of what happens when national media parachutes in, and then they, again, I think of the Coeur d'Alene firefighter shooting. This was a huge issue because um, when these firefighters were shot on Canfield Mountain, people immediately jumped to the Aryan nations or Aryan
Mhm.
nation ties. And, that's something to have in your back pocket as a thought. But um, people were putting it out like it was fact, or people, national news was making the connection that
Right.
maybe wasn't there yet. And ultimately it wasn't there. So I think that, you know, Idaho has that perception. And granted, there are a lot of things that come out of Idaho that maybe might validate people's opinions about those things, but you know, there are pockets that get overshadowed pretty frequently.
Well, and I think what you're saying is something interesting. And I think, even if people are thinking of the Aryan nations, like, yes, that existed, but also like the resistance to that was born out of the people who lived around that and saw that front firsthand and were like, no, this is bullshit. Like, we don't want this in our community. So, like, those things do go together. And I also, the other point I want to make is like, I think it's easy for East Coast media or people who aren't familiar to make Idaho into a boogeyman punching bag so they can be like, look at Chuck Schumer, he's so great. And it's like, well, Chuck Schumer has a lot of fucking problems, right? Like, let's let's not contrast that. But I think it's easy to denigrate, rural communities and Western communities because we just, these journalists don't live here. And so it's easy to sort of create a straw man opponent out of
Mhm.
stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I constantly tell. I mean, I could name a million times, not a million, but a million times where I've been like,
Go.
"Oh my God," and
One.
even on Twitter yeah, before I deleted Twitter, just literally begging people, like, please, like, that we live here, we know, like, stuff.
Mhm.
And I mean, the Moscow homicides is a great example of this. Like, it
Right.
was, I felt like I was pleading more with audiences and trying to correct misinformation than I was doing reporting on the actual, murders, because
Mhm.
so much misinformation, so much perception, like, oh, Moscow is an unsafe town. And I went to school there, and I can tell you right now that it's not an unsafe town.
Mhm.
But again, like, they don't, that's again, that's why listening to local media is so important. But
Yeah, well, we just had local news day yesterday, and for people who live in the Northwest, I mean, the Spokesman Review is an excellent newspaper. As far as I know, it's like completely free available, right? Because you all are nonprofit now. Is that correct?
not yet. We're working towards that transition.
Okay.
Yeah, where
Yeah.
it's a process. It's step by step, but yeah,
Cool.
slowly but surely. There
Cool.
are free articles people can read from people that are
Well,
funded
people should
by
sign up and
these
pay
grants.
and contribute regardless of whether the article.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Um, I guess my last question would be like, so, much of this legislation didn't pass, obviously, I'm sure due to some of this pushback. I can't imagine a lawmaker wants to pass a bill that, the police are saying this is not appropriate. But my question is like, do you think this is the end of this type of legislation? Do you think, there's still interest in getting more local law enforcement involved in immigration enforcement in Idaho? I mean, what's your perception there?
I think that similar bills are probably likely to come up next session. This happens a good amount of time where if something doesn't make it through by the very end, it will be adjusted and taken up and more fine-tuned the next year, if that's still an issue that lawmakers want to pursue. Um, it's possible immigration might not be the hot topic next year. I don't know. Among lawmakers, at least, I just remember, like, Idaho lawmakers definitely go through phases of certain things. Like, I remember one year it was critical race theory was a really, really big topic,
Mm.
and a lot of legislation was based on critical race theory. But now you don't hear much about that. You don't hear much
Hmm.
about critical race theory. You don't hear um, those types of terms much anymore, at least in my perspective. So I think that it's always subject to change, and that happens pretty frequently. But again, like, it really just depends on what the issue. Again, they're somewhat based on what is going on nationally, and if
Like
immigration
a
continues to be
culture, a legislative policy of culture war, which is, I don't know. To me personally, that is not necessarily like where good policy comes out of. Where it's like, what's the hot topic debate of today? Yeah.
Yeah, and again, like I can't speak for those lawmakers, but
Hmm.
a lot of the legislation does get centered around what the national conversation is, what we're focused on, what we're um COVID-19, that I mean, that was something.
Right.
So, lots of legislation around federal involvement. And I mean,
Hmm.
like I was talking to you
In the
before,
opposite way, I
Idaho.
assume, where it's
In the
saying we
in
don't
the
want.
opposing way, yeah.
Right.
Yes, like that we don't want the federal government telling us that we have to wear masks, or we don't want the federal government, and Idaho did reject federal money for federal COVID, some of the federal COVID relief funds. So yeah, again, it's really just dependent, I think, on what's going on.
Mhm.
And anything is possible next year.
Yeah, totally. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people go find your work if they want to learn more about what you're covering now?
You can find me at the Spokesman's webpage, I guess, with my name.
All right.
And I have a Blue Sky account also, and I post my stories on Instagram, on my own Instagram, just so people can see it when they're scrolling, because the kids
The
like to
kids in
scroll
their
these days. I want
I
to get
know.
the kids involved in local news, so
It
I can
is,
yeah.
you're a very young reporter. It's very funny to me to watch younger reporters or go through that phase where it's like, "Oh my gosh, I'm losing I don't know what the 17-year-olds are into these days." So
I know, because I feel like I was so in with the kids before, and I'm like, I don't even know what to wear, because if I wear something, I look like a millennial. If I wear something else, I look like a Gen Alpha, or a 16-year-old. I'm like, I don't know. It's hard being in your 20s, as they say,
It
I
it is
guess.
indeed. It is indeed. All right. Thank you,
Yeah.
Alex. Have a great day.
Yep. Yep.
Bye.